helicopter pilot's voice crackled through the static-filled radio with an urgency that made the dispatcher's blood run cold in the Emergency Operations Center nearly 200 miles away from the remote Alaskan wilderness, where something terrible had just been discovered. Base, this is Alaska 7-4, Charlie. I need immediate medical evacuation at coordinates 63 degrees, 47 minutes, 12 seconds north, 151 degrees, 23 minutes, 8 seconds west. I've got multiple casualties down here, and I mean multiple. There's blood everywhere, torn clothing scattered across maybe 50 yards of riverbank, and what looks like drag marks leading into the timber. I can see 2 people moving, but barely. And there's a third who... The transmission cut to static for several long seconds that felt like hours to everyone listening before the pilot's shaken voice returned. Jesus Christ, I've never seen anything like this. One of them is waving at me with what's left of his arm. Get every bird you can in the air right now and tell the trauma team at Fairbanks Memorial that they're going to need all the blood they can get their hands on. The pilot, Captain Mike Rodriguez, a 23-year veteran of bush flying, who had seen everything the Alaskan wilderness could throw at him from crash planes to avalanche victims, circled lower in his bright orange Bell 206 rescue helicopter, trying to make sense of the carnage spread out along the gravel bar beside the Kantishna River. Through his aviator sunglasses, he could see the remnants of what had been a peaceful fishing camp just hours earlier transformed into something that looked like a war zone, with a blue dome tent collapsed and shredded, fishing gear scattered and bent, coolers overturned and their contents strewn across the rocky shoreline, and sleeping bags that were no longer the cheerful red and green they had been manufactured to be, but were instead stained dark with blood that was already beginning to attract clouds of flies in the late August heat. The scene below him told a story of violence so sudden and overwhelming that his mind struggled to process it, even as his trained pilot's eyes cataloged every detail for the rescue teams that would soon be racing across the vast emptiness of interior Alaska to reach this remote stretch of river where 3 friends had come to fish for king salmon and instead had encountered something that would change their lives forever. Rodriguez had been flying search and rescue missions in Alaska for more than 2 decades, had pulled countless hunters and hikers and fishermen out of situations that should have killed them, had seen what avalanches could do to the human body and what 40 below temperatures could do to exposed flesh, and what falling through ice could do to someone's chances of survival. But nothing in his extensive experience with the ways the wilderness could destroy human beings had prepared him for the scene spread out beneath his helicopter, as he maintained his hover pattern and tried to coordinate with the emergency medical teams that were already spinning up at hospitals across the state. The morning sun, climbing steadily toward its late summer zenith, cast harsh shadows that made the blood appear almost black against the pale river rocks, and the silence that seemed to emanate from the destroyed campsite was somehow more unsettling than any sound could have been, broken only by the rhythmic thumping of his rotor blades and the occasional movement from the 2 figures he could see trying to drag themselves toward his aircraft. To understand how 3 close friends from Anchorage had arrived at this moment of unimaginable horror beside a remote salmon stream in the heart of Denali National Park, we must go back to the beginning of what had started as a celebration of friendship and a chance to escape the increasingly hectic pace of their urban lives for a week of fishing in one of the most beautiful and untamed places left on Earth. The Kantishna River winds through the northernmost reaches of Denali National Park, like a silver ribbon threading between mountains that have stood for millions of years, their peaks carved by glaciers that advanced and retreated countless times throughout the Pleistocene epoch, leaving behind a landscape of extraordinary beauty and harsh indifference to human ambition. This particular stretch of the river, approximately 130 miles southwest of Fairbanks and nearly 200 miles northwest of Anchorage, flows through what geologists call the Kantishna Hills, a region of moderate elevation that serves as a transition zone between the massive Alaska Range to the south and the vast Yukon River Basin to the north. The hills themselves rarely exceed 4,000 feet in elevation, but they provide a crucial corridor for wildlife movement and create a unique ecosystem that supports one of the highest concentrations of brown bears in North America. The geological foundation of this region was laid down over hundreds of millions of years as tectonic forces pushed ancient seafloor sediments high above sea level, creating the metamorphic rocks that form the backbone of the Kantishna Hills. Subsequent periods of volcanism added layers of igneous intrusions, while repeated glaciation carved the valleys and created the complex drainage patterns that characterize the region today. The Kantishna River itself is fed by dozens of smaller streams that cascade down from the surrounding peaks, carrying with them the mineral-rich sediments that make these waters among the most productive salmon spawning grounds in interior Alaska. During the summer months, the river runs clear and cold, perfect for the king salmon that begin their spawning run in late July and continue through August, drawing not only human anglers but also the massive brown bears that depend on this annual protein bonanza to build the fat reserves they will need to survive the long winter hibernation that lies ahead. The nearest permanent human settlement is the village of Kantishna, population 37 year-round residents located nearly 40 miles downstream from where the fishing camp had been established. Beyond that, the closest town of any significant size is Fairbanks, accessible only by a harrowing 2-hour flight over some of the most unforgiving wilderness in North America. This isolation, complete and absolute, is precisely what draws people to the region, but it also means that when something goes wrong, help is always hours away at best, and sometimes not available at all when weather or mechanical problems ground the small aircraft that serve as the only reliable transportation link to the outside world. The climate in this region is classified as subarctic continental, characterized by long, brutally cold winters, where temperatures can drop to 50 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, and short, surprisingly warm summers where afternoon temperatures can reach into the 80s. The transition between seasons happens with startling suddenness, and August represents the peak of summer abundance when the land briefly explodes with life before beginning its inevitable slide toward winter dormancy. Average temperatures during the late summer fishing season range from nighttime lows in the 40s to daytime highs in the 70s. But weather patterns can change without warning, and afternoon thunderstorms are common, often bringing sudden drops in temperature and dangerous lightning strikes that can turn a pleasant fishing trip into a survival situation in minutes. The summer of this particular year had been unusually warm and dry, with rainfall totals running nearly 30% below normal, and temperatures averaging 5 to 8 degrees higher than the long-term mean. This weather pattern had several important implications for wildlife behavior that the three friends could not have anticipated when they planned their trip months earlier in the comfort of an Anchorage sporting goods store. The drought conditions had reduced the berry crop that normally provides a crucial food source for brown bears preparing for hibernation, forcing them to concentrate more heavily around salmon streams where they could find the high-fat protein they desperately needed. Additionally, the warm temperatures had accelerated snowmelt in the high country, causing stream levels to drop earlier than usual and concentrating salmon runs into a shorter time window, which in turn concentrated bear activity both temporally and spatially in ways that created conditions for increased human-bear encounters. The forest that surrounds the Kantishna River in this region is a complex mosaic of different vegetation communities, each adapted to specific conditions of drainage, elevation, and exposure that create distinct microhabitats within the larger ecosystem. The dominant trees are white spruce, some reaching heights of 60 to 80 feet and ages of 300 years or more, their dark green needles creating a dense canopy that filters the long summer sunlight into a cathedral-like dimness at ground level. Interspersed among the spruce are paper birch trees with their distinctive white bark marked by horizontal black lines, their bright green leaves providing brilliant splashes of color against the darker conifers, and serving as an important food source for moose and other browsing animals. Along the river itself, thick stands of willow and alder create nearly impenetrable thickets that can grow to heights of 15 to 20 feet, their branches intertwining to form natural barriers that channel both human and animal movement along established trails and game paths. The understory beneath these trees is dominated by a rich mixture of shrubs and herbaceous plants that create a complex three-dimensional habitat structure. Labrador tea, with its distinctive leathery leaves and white flower clusters, grows in dense mats across the forest floor, while high bush cranberry and low bush blueberry provide crucial food sources for bears, birds, and small mammals throughout the summer and fall. The ground layer consists of thick carpets of moss, primarily feather moss and stairstep moss, that retain moisture and create ideal growing conditions for wild mushrooms, ferns, and the countless small plants that form the foundation of the forest food web. This vegetation structure is critically important for bear behavior because it provides both food sources and cover, allowing these massive predators to move through the forest with surprising stealth despite their size. The berry production in this particular ecosystem is legendary among both wildlife biologists and the animals that depend on it for survival. Blueberries, cloudberries, lingonberries, and crowberries ripen in sequence throughout the summer, providing bears with a progression of high-energy foods that can constitute up to 80% of their diet during peak seasons. However, the drought conditions of this year had significantly reduced berry production across the region, with some areas reporting crop failures of 60 to 70% compared to normal years. This shortfall would prove to be a crucial factor in the events that were about to unfold, as bears that would normally be dispersed across thousands of square miles foraging for berries were instead forced to concentrate around salmon streams where they could find adequate nutrition. The fauna of the Kantishna region represents one of the most diverse and abundant wildlife populations in North America, a testament to the pristine nature of this ecosystem and its distance from significant human disturbance. Caribou herds numbering in the thousands migrate through the area each fall, their hoofbeats creating a sound like distant thunder as they move across the tundra in long, undulating lines that stretch to the horizon. Moose, the largest members of the deer family, are year-round residents that can weigh up to 1,500 pounds and stand 6 feet tall at the shoulder, their massive antlers and surprising agility making them one of the most dangerous animals in Alaska for the unprepared traveler. Dall sheep inhabit the higher elevations, their white coats standing out against the dark rock faces where they navigate terrain that seems impossible for any four-legged animal to traverse. The rivers and streams support healthy populations of all 5 species of Pacific salmon, with king salmon being the most prized by both human anglers and the bears that hunt them. These fish, some weighing 40 pounds or more, make their spawning run from the Bering Sea up through hundreds of miles of river systems to reach the exact gravel beds where they were born years earlier, their bodies transforming from bright silver ocean fish to the hook-jawed, mottled red and green spawning colors that signal the final stage of their life cycle. Arctic grayling, with their distinctive sail-like dorsal fins, inhabit the clear pools and eddies throughout the watershed, while northern pike lurk in the slower backwaters where they ambush smaller fish with lightning-fast strikes. The predator community in this region is dominated by brown bears, the coastal subspecies of grizzly bear that can reach weights of 800 pounds or more for adult males, though the interior population tends to be somewhat smaller due to dietary differences. Current estimates suggest a population density of approximately 1 bear per 4 to 5 square miles in prime habitat, which may seem sparse until one considers that each adult bear requires a territory of 20 to 50 square miles to meet its nutritional needs throughout the year. These bears are not the somewhat predictable and human-habituated animals found in more developed areas like Yellowstone or Glacier National Parks, but rather truly wild bears that have had minimal contact with humans and retain all of their natural wariness and unpredictability. Black bears also inhabit the region, though in lower numbers than their brown cousins, and wolf packs roam territories that can encompass several hundred square miles, their hunting pressure helping to maintain the health and alertness of prey species populations. Lynx, wolverines, and other smaller predators round out a carnivore community that has remained essentially unchanged for thousands of years. The bird life is equally diverse, with golden eagles and rough-legged hawks soaring on thermals above the valleys, while ptarmigan, grouse, and countless species of waterfowl fill specific niches within the ecosystem. During the summer of this incident, wildlife biologists had documented unusual concentrations of brown bears along salmon streams throughout the region, with some observers reporting densities nearly double the normal range. Radio-collared bears that had been tracked for multiple years were showing movement patterns that differed significantly from their historical ranges, with animals traveling much greater distances to reach salmon streams and remaining in those areas for extended periods, rather than dispersing to traditional berry-picking grounds. Several incidents had been reported to park authorities involving aggressive bears that seemed less willing than usual to yield fishing spots to humans, and at least 3 bears had been observed fishing at times of day when they would normally be resting, suggesting increased competition for limited salmon resources. The 3 men whose lives would intersect with this unprecedented bear activity had known each other since their college days at the University of Alaska Anchorage, where they had met as freshmen in the engineering program and quickly bonded over their shared love of the outdoors and their dreams of careers that would allow them to live and work in the state they all considered the last true frontier. David Michael Chen, known to his friends as Dave, was 34 years old and stood 5 feet 10 inches tall with the lean, wiry build of someone who spent most of his free time hiking, skiing, or fishing. His black hair was beginning to show the first traces of gray at the temples, and his dark brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses reflected the sharp intelligence that had made him one of the youngest project managers in the history of the Alaska Department of Transportation, where he oversaw the maintenance of remote highway sections that required both engineering expertise and an intimate understanding of how to work safely in wilderness conditions. Dave had grown up in Anchorage as the eldest son of immigrants from Taiwan who had arrived in Alaska in the 1970s seeking opportunities in the expanding oil industry. His father, Dr. James Chen, had built a successful medical practice specializing in occupational medicine for oil field workers, while his mother, Susan, had taught mathematics at Anchorage High School for over 20 years before retiring to focus on her passion for traditional Chinese watercolor painting. Dave's upbringing had been a unique blend of traditional Asian values emphasizing education and family responsibility, combined with the rugged individualism and outdoor lifestyle that characterized Alaska culture. He had learned to fish on the streams around Anchorage as a boy, progressing from catching small rainbow trout in easily accessible waters to planning increasingly ambitious trips into remote areas where the fishing was better but the risks were correspondingly higher. His engineering training had given him a methodical approach to trip planning that his friends sometimes found obsessive, but which had kept them safe on dozens of previous adventures. Dave was the one who studied topographic maps for hours, researching weather patterns, and consulting with local guides and outfitters to understand current conditions. He maintained detailed logs of every fishing trip, recording not just the number and size of fish caught, but also weather conditions, bear sign observed, equipment performance, and lessons learned that could be applied to future excursions. His basement workshop in his modest split-level home in the hillside area of Anchorage was filled with carefully organized fishing gear, much of it modified or repaired by his own hands, and his bookshelves contained an extensive collection of guidebooks, wildlife biology texts, and first aid manuals that he studied with the same intensity he brought to highway engineering problems. Dave's personality was characterized by a quiet competence that made others naturally look to him for leadership in challenging situations. He was not the most talkative member of the group, preferring to listen and observe before offering opinions. But when he did speak, his words carried weight because his friends knew they were based on careful thought and extensive preparation. His sense of humor was dry and subtle, often expressed through perfectly timed observations about the gap between outdoor magazine articles and the reality of Alaska wilderness. Conditions. He had never married, though he had been in a serious relationship with a wildlife biologist named Sarah for nearly 3 years, and his friends suspected that his reluctance to commit was related to his fear that marriage and children would limit his ability to undertake the kind of wilderness adventures that gave his life meaning. The second member of the group, Robert William Thompson, universally known as Bobby, was 35 years old and represented almost the complete opposite of Dave's careful, methodical approach to life. Bobby stood 6 feet 2 inches tall and weighed nearly 200 pounds, with the broad shoulders and thick forearms of someone who had spent his adult life working in Alaska's commercial fishing industry. His reddish-brown hair was usually hidden under a variety of baseball caps advertising fishing charters, equipment manufacturers, or Alaskan destinations, and his pale blue eyes held a perpetual hint of mischief that suggested he was always looking for the next adventure or practical joke. His face was weathered by years of exposure to salt spray, Arctic winds, and summer sun, giving him the appearance of someone older than his actual age. But his energy and enthusiasm for new experiences remained those of a much younger man. Bobby had grown up in the small fishing community of Kodiak, where his father owned and operated a 36-foot salmon seiner that had provided a modest but steady living for the Thompson family for over 20 years. From the time he could walk, Bobby had spent his summers on the deck of the Sarah's Dream, named for his mother, learning the intricate skills required to locate, pursue, and capture salmon in the challenging waters around Kodiak Island. The work was physically demanding and often dangerous, requiring split-second decisions in conditions where a mistake could mean the loss of equipment worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, or, worse, the loss of life in the notoriously treacherous Gulf of Alaska. This background had given Bobby an intuitive understanding of weather, water conditions, and fish behavior that could not be learned from books, but it had also instilled in him a tendency toward impulsive decision-making that sometimes created tension with his more cautious friends. After high school, Bobby had followed his girlfriend to Anchorage, where he enrolled in the University of Alaska's engineering program, more to stay close to her than out of any particular passion for the subject matter. The relationship had ended during his sophomore year, but by then he had discovered that he enjoyed the logical problem-solving aspects of engineering and had made friends with Dave and Mark, who shared his love of fishing and outdoor adventure. After graduation, he had surprised everyone by accepting a position with a consulting firm that specialized in designing and building fish processing facilities, rather than returning to Kodiak to take over his father's fishing operation. The job required extensive travel to remote communities throughout Alaska and the Pacific Northwest, exposing him to different types of fishing operations and giving him a broad perspective on Alaska's seafood industry that proved valuable in his consulting work. Bobby's personality was characterized by an infectious optimism and a willingness to take risks that sometimes made his friends nervous, but which also led to some of their most memorable adventures. He was the one most likely to suggest extending a planned 3-day trip to 5 days because the fishing was good, or to propose trying a new route that looked challenging but potentially rewarding on the topographic map. His knowledge of commercial fishing operations gave him insights into fish behavior and migration patterns that often proved invaluable when planning trips, and his natural charisma made it easy for him to strike up conversations with guides, pilots, and locals who could provide crucial information about current conditions. However, his tendency to minimize risks and his confidence in his ability to handle whatever situations might arise sometimes led him to dismiss warnings or safety concerns that his more cautious friends took seriously. The third member of the group, Mark Stephen Kowalski, was 33 years old and served as something of a mediator between Dave's careful planning and Bobby's spontaneous enthusiasm. Mark stood 5 feet 11 inches tall with the solid build of someone who stayed in shape through regular exercise but who had never been naturally athletic. His brown hair was kept short in a style appropriate for his position as a senior accountant with one of Anchorage's largest firms, and his brown eyes behind contact lenses reflected the analytical mind that made him excellent at his profession, but sometimes caused him to overthink recreational decisions. His fair complexion required constant attention to sun protection during outdoor activities, and his friends had learned to pack extra sunscreen and remind him to reapply it regularly during long days on the water. Mark had grown up in a Polish-American family in the Chicago suburbs, where his father worked as a machinist in a steel mill and his mother raised 4 children while taking in sewing to supplement the family income. The Kowalski household had been characterized by hard work, frugal living, and a strong emphasis on education as the path to a better life. Mark had excelled in mathematics throughout school and had earned a full scholarship to Northwestern University, where he planned to study engineering before discovering that he had a natural aptitude for accounting and finance. After graduation, he had worked for several years with a large firm in Chicago, before accepting a position with an Anchorage company that offered him the opportunity to combine his professional skills with his growing passion for outdoor recreation and wilderness travel. Mark's decision to move to Alaska had been motivated primarily by his desire to escape what he saw as the increasingly artificial and confined lifestyle of urban America. But his adjustment to Alaska's unique culture and demanding outdoor conditions had been more challenging than he had anticipated. His first fishing trip with Dave and Bobby had been a near disaster, with Mark suffering from seasickness, sunburn, and a complete lack of understanding about proper clothing and equipment for Alaskan conditions. However, his determination to master the skills required for safe and enjoyable wilderness travel had impressed his new friends, and over the years he had developed into a competent outdoorsman whose careful attention to detail complemented the different strengths that Dave and Bobby brought to their group adventures. Mark's personality was characterized by a methodical approach to problem solving and a tendency toward pessimism that his friends sometimes found annoying, but which often proved valuable in identifying potential problems before they became serious. He was the one most likely to check weather forecasts multiple times before a trip, to verify that all equipment was in good working order, and to insist on contingency plans for various emergency scenarios. His accounting background made him naturally suited to handling the financial and logistical aspects of trip planning, and his attention to detail ensured that permits were obtained, reservations were confirmed, and equipment lists were complete. However, his tendency to worry about everything that could go wrong sometimes prevented him from fully enjoying experiences that Dave and Bobby found exhilarating. The friendship between these three men had been forged through dozens of shared adventures over more than a decade, from weekend camping trips to week-long expeditions into some of Alaska's most remote wilderness areas. They had survived equipment failures, unexpected weather, difficult river crossings, and close encounters with wildlife that had tested their skills and strengthened their bonds. Each man brought different strengths to their partnership, and over the years they had developed a dynamic that balanced Dave's technical expertise, Bobby's intuitive understanding of Alaska conditions, and Mark's careful planning and risk assessment. Their friendship was characterized by constant, good-natured ribbing, ongoing debates about everything from fishing techniques to political issues, and an unspoken but absolute commitment to each other's safety and welfare that had been demonstrated repeatedly in challenging situations. The relationship between Dave and Bobby was perhaps the closest of the three pairings, based on their shared engineering background and their similar approach to outdoor challenges as technical problems to be solved through the application of knowledge, skill, and appropriate equipment. They often spent hours discussing the theoretical aspects of fishing, from the physics of fly casting to the behavioral ecology of salmon migration, and they collaborated on equipment modifications and fishing strategy developments that sometimes struck Mark as unnecessarily complicated. However, their friendship also contained an element of competition that could create tension, particularly when one of them was having significantly better fishing success than the other, or when they disagreed about the best approach to a particular challenge. Bobby and Mark's relationship was characterized by Bobby's role as Mark's mentor in developing outdoor skills, and Mark's function as Bobby's reality check when enthusiasm threatened to override good judgment. Bobby genuinely enjoyed teaching Mark new techniques and watching his growing confidence in wilderness situations, while Mark appreciated Bobby's willingness to share his extensive practical knowledge without making him feel inadequate about his slower learning curve. Their friendship was perhaps the most stable of the three pairings because their roles were clearly defined and complementary, with neither feeling competitive with the other. The dynamic between Dave and Mark was the most complex of the three relationships, combining mutual respect with occasional frustration about their different approaches to trip planning and decision-making. Dave appreciated Mark's thoroughness and attention to detail, but he sometimes found Mark's pessimism draining and his questions about safety procedures repetitive. Mark respected Dave's expertise and leadership abilities, but he occasionally felt that Dave was too willing to accept risks that could be easily avoided through better preparation or more conservative decision-making. Despite these minor tensions, both men recognized that their different perspectives made their group more effective and safer than any of them would be individually. The planning for this particular fishing trip had begun nearly 6 months earlier, during a February evening at Dave's house, when the three friends were examining maps and discussing potential destinations for their annual summer fishing expedition. The previous year's trip to the Brooks River in Katmai National Park had been spectacular from a fishing standpoint, with all three men catching multiple salmon and rainbow trout. But the area's popularity had meant sharing prime fishing spots with dozens of other anglers and dealing with the kind of crowds and regulations that contradicted their desire for a true wilderness experience. They had agreed that this year's trip should take them to a more remote location where they would be less likely to encounter other people and where the fishing pressure would be lighter, even if that meant accepting higher risks and more challenging logistics. Dave had initially proposed several locations in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, where his work with the Department of Transportation had given him access to detailed maps and local knowledge about stream conditions and access routes. The fishing in the Arctic streams was legendary, with massive populations of Arctic char, grayling, and northern pike that had never experienced significant angling pressure. But the logistics of reaching these streams and the potential complications of weather-related delays had made Mark nervous about committing to such an ambitious plan. Bobby had countered with suggestions for streams on the Alaska Peninsula, where his commercial fishing contacts had described excellent salmon runs and relatively easy access via float plane. But Dave had pointed out that the volcanic activity and unpredictable weather in that region created safety concerns that outweighed the fishing advantages. The Kantishna River had emerged as their destination almost by accident, when Dave discovered a reference to it in an obscure fishing guide that had been written by a bush pilot in the 1980s. The guide's description of massive king salmon runs, pristine water conditions, and virtually non-existent fishing pressure had captured their imagination, while the location within Denali National Park provided the wilderness setting they were seeking without the extreme remoteness that made Arctic locations so challenging. Additional research had revealed that the area was accessible via float plane or helicopter during the summer months, that camping was permitted along the river with proper permits, and that the late August timing they preferred would coincide with the peak of the king salmon run. Mark had taken responsibility for researching the permit requirements and reservation procedures, discovering that Denali National Park required advanced reservations for backcountry camping, but that permits were still available for their preferred dates in late August. The park's backcountry regulations were surprisingly flexible, allowing groups to establish camps anywhere along the river as long as they were at least 1 mile from any established trail and at least 1/4 mile from the river itself. The regulations also required that all food be stored in bear-resistant containers and that camps be established in areas with good visibility to avoid surprising wildlife, requirements that seemed reasonable and well within their capabilities to meet. Dave had focused his research on the technical aspects of the trip, studying topographic maps to identify potential camping sites, researching weather patterns for the region during late August, and investigating equipment requirements for the specific conditions they would encounter. His analysis had indicated that late August was generally the most stable weather period for the region, with average temperatures in the comfortable range and relatively low precipitation, though he had noted that conditions could change rapidly and that they should be prepared for everything from frost to thunderstorms. The equipment requirements were more challenging than their previous trips because of the remote location and the need to be completely self-sufficient for up to a week, but they had all been accumulating high-quality wilderness gear for years and were confident in their ability to handle the additional demands. Bobby had concentrated his efforts on understanding the fish populations and behavior patterns that would determine their fishing success, consulting with guides and outfitters who had experience in the region, and researching the scientific literature on salmon migration patterns in interior Alaska streams. His investigation had revealed that king salmon began entering the Kantishna system in mid-July, with the run building to peak numbers in early August before declining through the remainder of the month. However, several sources had suggested that the largest fish were often caught later in the run, as the smaller males completed their spawning cycles and the massive females remained in the system longer to protect their redds. This information had influenced their decision to schedule the trip for the last week of August, accepting the lower overall fish numbers in exchange for the possibility of encountering truly trophy-sized salmon. The three friends had spent countless hours during the spring and early summer discussing equipment selections, with each item evaluated not only for its performance characteristics, but also for its weight and packability given the airline and charter flight restrictions they would face in reaching their destination. They had ultimately decided to invest in several pieces of new gear specifically for this trip, including lightweight backpacking tents rated for 4-season use, sleeping bags designed for temperatures down to 20 degrees below zero, and a comprehensive first aid kit that included prescription medications for potential emergencies. The fishing equipment had required particularly careful consideration because they needed gear capable of handling large salmon in challenging conditions, while remaining light enough for backpacking and durable enough to survive rough handling by charter pilots and baggage handlers. Their food planning had been equally meticulous, with meals designed to provide adequate nutrition and energy, while minimizing weight and maximizing storage life in the bear-resistant containers required by park regulations. They had ultimately settled on a combination of freeze-dried meals for dinners, energy bars, and dried fruit for lunches, and instant oatmeal with dried fruit for breakfasts, supplemented by coffee, tea, and emergency rations that could sustain them for several additional days if weather or mechanical problems delayed their pickup. The total food weight for the group came to approximately 45 pounds for 5 days, which they considered reasonable given the high calorie requirements of wilderness camping and the possibility of extended delays. The most challenging aspect of the planning process had been arranging transportation to and from their chosen fishing location, which was accessible only by small aircraft operating from a gravel airstrip near the village of Kantishna, After investigating several options, they had contracted with Midnight Sun Aviation, a charter service operating out of Fairbanks that specialized in wilderness access flights and had an excellent safety record for operations in Denali National Park. The company's chief pilot, Captain Susan Morrison, had flown the Kantishna River area numerous times and had provided valuable advice about landing sites, weather considerations, and current bear activity in the region that had helped finalize their trip planning. Captain Morrison had been particularly emphatic about bear safety, noting that the salmon run coincided with the period when brown bears were most actively feeding in preparation for winter hibernation, and warning that bear encounters were not just possible but virtually certain during their planned visit. She had recommended that they carry bear spray and noisemakers, that they establish their camp in an open area with good visibility in all directions, and that they be prepared to abandon their campsite immediately if bear activity made their location untenable. Her warnings had led to extensive discussions about bear safety protocols, with all three men agreeing to review the literature on bear behavior and to purchase additional safety equipment beyond what they had carried on previous trips. The group's preparation for bear encounters had included reading several books on bear behavior and safety, attending a bear safety seminar offered by the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and practicing with bear spray until they were confident in their ability to deploy it quickly and accurately under stress. They had also invested in a comprehensive bear safety kit that included multiple canisters of spray, noisemakers, emergency flares, and a detailed protocol for responding to different types of bear encounters. Despite these preparations, their understanding of bear behavior was largely theoretical, based on books and seminars rather than extensive personal experience, and none of them had ever been involved in a serious bear encounter that tested their knowledge and equipment under real-world conditions. Mark had been particularly concerned about bear safety, spending hours researching bear attack statistics and developing contingency plans for various scenarios that his friends sometimes found excessive but which reflected his natural tendency to worry about everything that could go wrong. His research had revealed that brown bear attacks in Alaska were relatively rare, with an average of only 1 or 2 fatalities per year statewide, but that the vast majority of attacks occurred during surprise encounters when bears were defending cubs or food sources. This information had reinforced their decision to make noise while moving through dense vegetation and to avoid fishing during dawn and dusk hours when bear activity was highest. Bobby had approached bear safety from a different perspective, focusing on the behavioral aspects that would help them avoid encounters rather than the defensive measures required if an encounter occurred. His commercial fishing experience had given him some exposure to brown bears along salmon streams, though always from the relative safety of a boat, and he was confident that their group's noise and human scent would be sufficient to keep bears at a distance as long as they remained alert and avoided obviously dangerous situations. His optimism about their ability to coexist peacefully with bears had sometimes clashed with Mark's more pessimistic assessments, but the discussions had ultimately led to a comprehensive safety plan that incorporated elements of both avoidance and defensive response. The three friends had made their final preparations during the week before their departure, with each man taking responsibility for specific aspects of the logistical arrangements while maintaining communication about last-minute changes or concerns that might affect their plans. Dave had confirmed their charter flight arrangements and reviewed weather forecasts that showed favorable conditions for their planned dates, though he had noted the possibility of afternoon thunderstorms that could complicate their pickup schedule. Mark had obtained their final permits and confirmed that all fees had been paid, while also arranging for emergency contacts and notification procedures that would alert authorities if they failed to return as scheduled. Bobby had made final equipment checks and arranged for perishable food items to be purchased in Fairbanks rather than transported from Anchorage. Their journey to the fishing location had begun on a bright Friday morning in late August when they departed Anchorage on Alaska Airlines Flight 66 to Fairbanks, their fishing gear and camping equipment packed in duffel bags and hard cases that had been carefully weighed and inventoried to ensure compliance with both airline and charter flight restrictions. The commercial flight had been routine and comfortable, with clear weather providing spectacular views of the Alaska Range and Denali as they approached Fairbanks International Airport, where Captain Morrison was waiting to transfer their gear to her de Havilland Beaver float plane for the final leg of their journey into the wilderness. Captain Morrison, a veteran Alaska pilot with more than 15 years of experience flying wilderness access missions, had briefed them thoroughly on the flight plan and safety procedures during their pre-flight preparations at her company's small terminal building adjacent to the main airport. She had explained that the flight would take approximately 90 minutes each way, following a route that would take them northwest from Fairbanks, across the Tanana River Valley, before turning southwest into Denali National Park and the Kantishna River drainage. Weather conditions were excellent for flying, with clear skies, light winds, and visibility unlimited, though she had warned them that afternoon thunderstorms were possible later in the day and could affect their pickup schedule the following Friday. The flight itself had been an extraordinary experience that reminded all three men why they loved Alaska and why they were willing to accept the risks and challenges of wilderness travel to experience landscapes that remained essentially unchanged from their primordial condition. The Beaver had climbed steadily after takeoff, providing panoramic views of Fairbanks and the surrounding countryside before entering the vast wilderness that stretched unbroken to the horizon in every direction. Below them, the landscape unfolded like a three-dimensional map, with rivers meandering through valleys, lakes reflecting the sky like scattered mirrors, and mountains rising in serried ranks toward the distant peaks of the Alaska Range. As they approached the Kantishna River, Captain Morrison had circled their intended landing area to assess conditions and identify potential obstacles, pointing out the gravel bar where she planned to land and the nearby area where they could establish their camp. The river appeared to be running at ideal levels for both flying and fishing, with clear water and numerous deep pools that promised excellent salmon habitat. Bear trails were visible along the riverbanks, and Morrison had noted several areas where the vegetation had been disturbed by feeding bears, but she had seen no animals during her reconnaissance and had declared the area suitable for their purposes. The landing had been accomplished with the casual competence that characterized experienced bush pilots, with Morrison setting the Beaver down gently on the gravel bar and taxiing to a position where the men could unload their gear without getting their feet wet. The silence that enveloped them as the engine shut down was profound and immediate, broken only by the sound of water moving over rocks and the distant call of a loon that emphasized rather than diminished the sense of absolute solitude that defined their new environment. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the sense of spruce, willow, and the mineral smell of glacier-fed water that would become the backdrop for everything that followed. Their first impressions of the area had been overwhelmingly positive, with the river appearing even more beautiful than they had imagined from studying maps and photographs, and the fishing prospects looking excellent based on the clear water and abundant salmon habitat they could observe from their landing site. The weather was perfect for camping, with partly cloudy skies, light winds, and temperatures in the mid-60s that would make the work of establishing their camp comfortable and efficient. Captain Morrison had helped them carry their gear above the high water line before conducting a final briefing about pickup procedures and emergency communications, emphasizing the importance of maintaining their scheduled radio contact and being prepared for weather-related delays that could extend their stay by several days. After Morrison's departure, the three friends had spent several hours exploring the area and selecting a campsite that met both their practical requirements and the park's regulatory guidelines for backcountry camping. They had ultimately chosen a location approximately 1/4 mile upstream from the landing area, on a slight rise that provided good visibility in all directions while offering some protection from wind and access to firewood from the scattered driftwood along the riverbank. The site was more than adequate for their needs, with level ground for their tents, access to water for cooking and cleaning, and proximity to several promising fishing pools that they were eager to try once their camp was fully established. The process of establishing their camp had proceeded smoothly and efficiently, with each man taking responsibility for familiar tasks that they had practiced on dozens of previous trips. Dave had focused on setting up the cooking area and organizing their food supplies in the bear-resistant containers that were mandatory in this region, while Bobby had assembled the fishing gear and scouted the nearby water for the most promising locations. Mark had established the tent sites and sleeping areas, ensuring that their shelters were properly positioned and secured against the possibility of sudden weather changes that were always a concern in Alaska's interior regions. Their first evening in the wilderness had been everything they had hoped for, and more, with excellent fishing that produced several keeper-sized salmon for dinner and spectacular scenery that provided the perfect backdrop for the kind of relaxed conversation and storytelling that characterized their best camping experiences. The evening light lasted until nearly 10 o'clock, painting the surrounding landscape in shades of gold and crimson that seemed almost too beautiful to be real, while the sounds of feeding fish and calling birds created a natural symphony that reinforced their sense of having found a perfect escape from the pressures and complications of their normal urban lives. As they sat around their small campfire eating fresh salmon seasoned with wild herbs that Bobby had gathered along the riverbank, the three friends had discussed their plans for the following days and expressed their satisfaction with the location they had chosen and the success of their logistical planning. Dave had been particularly pleased with their campsite selection, noting that the visibility and wind patterns would help minimize their bear encounters while providing easy access to the best fishing water. Bobby had been excited about the fish populations he had observed during his scouting, predicting that they would have excellent fishing throughout their stay and might even encounter some truly trophy-sized salmon that would make this trip memorable for years to come. Mark had been relieved that their transportation and setup had proceeded without problems, allowing him to relax and enjoy the experience rather than worrying about the countless things that could have gone wrong. The conversation that night had ranged across many topics, from their analysis of the fishing techniques that had been most effective during their first evening, to their speculation about the wildlife they might encounter during their stay and their appreciation for the opportunity to experience this kind of pristine wilderness that was becoming increasingly rare even in Alaska. They had also discussed their observations about bear sign in the area, noting the numerous trails and feeding areas they had seen, but expressing confidence in their safety protocols and their ability to avoid problematic encounters through awareness and appropriate behavior. The evening had ended with all three men feeling optimistic about the days ahead and grateful for their friendship and their shared passion for wilderness experiences that continued to provide some of the most rewarding moments in their lives. Their sleep that first night had been deep and peaceful, aided by the physical fatigue of travel and camp setup, as well as the profound silence that enveloped their campsite once the fire had burned down to glowing embers and they had retreated to their tents. The temperature had dropped into the 40s during the early morning hours, making their warm sleeping bags feel luxurious and encouraging them to sleep later than they might have at home. But they had awakened refreshed and eager to begin their first full day of fishing in this spectacular location. The second day had begun with a hearty breakfast of oatmeal, dried fruit, and coffee that provided the energy they would need for a full day of fishing, followed by a final review of their safety protocols and a discussion of their strategy for exploring the different pools and runs they had identified during their evening reconnaissance. The weather remained ideal for their purposes, with partly cloudy skies that would provide enough shade to keep the fish active while allowing sufficient light for photography and navigation. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the sounds of awakening wildlife and the promise of excellent fishing conditions that had all three men eager to get their lines in the water. Their fishing strategy for the day had involved splitting up to cover more water, with Dave working the pool immediately below their camp, Bobby exploring upstream areas that required some hiking through brush and overfallen logs, and Mark focusing on a series of runs and eddies that extended downstream from their landing area. This division of effort would allow them to evaluate different areas and techniques while maintaining the visual and vocal contact that was essential for safety in bear country. They had agreed to regroup at camp for lunch and to share information about their morning's discoveries and fishing success. The fishing that morning had been even better than their optimistic expectations, with all three men encountering fish almost immediately and experiencing the kind of action that makes for legendary fishing stories. Dave's pool had produced several beautiful king salmon in the 20 to 30 pound range, fish that fought with the power and determination that makes salmon fishing so addictive for those who experience it. Bobby's upstream exploration had revealed a series of pools that appeared to be holding significant numbers of fish, including some individuals that he estimated might exceed 40 pounds based on the glimpses he had gotten during brief hookups that had ended with broken lines and bent hooks. Mark's downstream fishing had been perhaps the most productive of the morning, with steady action that included not only salmon but also several beautiful Arctic grayling and a northern pike that had provided variety and kept him constantly engaged with his tackle. The diversity of species available in the river system had exceeded their expectations and provided the kind of fishing experience that justified all the planning, expense, and effort required to reach such a remote location. The The success had been so consistent that all three men had been able to be selective about the fish they kept for meals, releasing the majority of their catches and retaining only what they could reasonably consume during their stay. The first clear indication that their wilderness paradise might harbor serious dangers had come during Mark's return to camp for their planned lunch meeting. When he had discovered fresh bear tracks in the muddy area adjacent to the pool where he had been fishing most successfully. The tracks were unmistakably from a brown bear, with the characteristic long claws and massive pad size that distinguish them from black bear sign, and they appeared to be very recent, possibly made within the previous few hours while Mark had been fishing in the immediate area. The realization that a large predator had been nearby without his knowledge had been unsettling, but not immediately alarming since bear encounters were expected in this region, and the animal had apparently moved on without creating any direct confrontation. When Mark had reported his discovery to Dave and Bobby during their lunch break, the group had discussed the implications and agreed that the presence of bears in the immediate vicinity required increased vigilance but did not necessarily indicate any immediate danger, as long as they maintained their safety protocols and remained alert to changing conditions. Dave had noted that bear activity around salmon streams was completely normal and expected during this time of year, while Bobby had pointed out that the bear had apparently detected Mark's presence and moved away rather than approaching, which suggested normal avoidance behavior rather than the kind of aggressive or habituated behavior that would be truly concerning. The discussion about bear safety had continued throughout their lunch break, with all three men reviewing the protocols they had practiced and ensuring that their bear spray and noisemakers were easily accessible and ready for immediate use if needed. Mark had expressed some concern about continuing to fish alone in areas where fresh bear sign had been discovered, but Dave and Bobby had convinced him that the benefits of covering more water outweighed the slightly increased risks as long as they maintained frequent communication and avoided areas with limited visibility where a surprise encounter would be more likely. The consensus had been that they should continue their planned fishing strategy while increasing their awareness and taking additional precautions to avoid surprising any bears that might be feeding in the area. The afternoon fishing had proceeded without incident, with all three men remaining more alert to their surroundings while continuing to enjoy the excellent fishing that had characterized their morning efforts. The salmon runs appeared to be at their peak, with fresh fish moving through the system constantly and providing nearly continuous action for anyone willing to invest the time and effort required to fish effectively for these powerful and challenging fish. The weather had remained ideal throughout the day, though afternoon clouds had begun building over the mountains to the south, in a pattern that suggested possible thunderstorms during the evening hours. Their return to camp as evening approached had revealed additional bear sign that had not been present during their morning departure, including several areas where the vegetation had been disturbed and what appeared to be a daybed where a bear had rested during the afternoon hours. The proximity of this sign to their camp had been somewhat concerning, but the bear had apparently moved on without investigating their tents or food storage areas, suggesting that their precautions were effective and that the animal was following normal patterns of behavior around human activity. The group had agreed that the increased bear activity required additional vigilance during their remaining time in the area, but that their safety protocols appeared to be working effectively to prevent direct encounters. Their second evening in camp had been marked by spectacular fishing during the extended twilight hours that characterized late summer evenings in interior Alaska, with salmon activity reaching levels that exceeded even their most optimistic expectations. The fish had seemed to be particularly active during the low-light conditions, providing the kind of fast-paced action that had all three men fishing until well after dark and comparing their experiences to the legendary fishing stories they had read about Alaska in its earliest days of sport fishing development. The evening's fishing had been so productive that they had been able to catch enough fish for several meals, while releasing many more beautiful salmon that would continue their spawning cycles and contribute to the future health of the river system. The campfire that night had been the backdrop for the kind of conversation and storytelling that represents the essence of successful wilderness camping trips, with each man sharing his most memorable moments from the day and discussing techniques and observations that would help improve their fishing success during the remaining days of their stay. The conversation had also touched on their growing appreciation for the pristine nature of the ecosystem they've were experiencing, from the crystal clear water that revealed every detail of the stream bottom to the complete absence of human impacts that made it possible to imagine how the entire continent might have appeared before European settlement. As they prepared for bed that second night, the three friends had expressed unanimous satisfaction with their trip planning and their choice of destination, agreeing that the experience was exceeding their expectations and providing the kind of wilderness adventure they had been seeking for years. The weather forecast for the following days remained favorable, with continued clear skies and stable conditions that would allow them to maximize their fishing opportunities while minimizing the weather-related risks that were always a concern during wilderness travel in Alaska. Their final conversation before retiring to their tents had focused on plans for the following day and their excitement about exploring additional water that they had not yet had time to fish thoroughly. The third day of their adventure had begun before dawn, with the distant sound of something large moving through the forest adjacent to their campsite, a sound that had awakened all three men simultaneously and sent them scrambling for their flashlights and bear spray in the pre-dawn darkness that filled their tents. The sounds had continued for several minutes, suggesting an animal of considerable size moving deliberately through the timber rather than the quick, light footsteps of smaller wildlife that characterized most of their nighttime encounters during previous camping trips. The movements had seemed to circle their camp at a distance of perhaps 50 yards, close enough to be clearly audible, but far enough away that they could not determine the exact nature of the animal responsible. Dave had been the first to emerge from his tent, bear spray in hand and flashlight ready, scanning the surrounding darkness for any sign of the animal that had awakened them all. The forest around their campsite was completely silent now, with none of the normal sounds of small animals or night birds that had provided a constant backdrop during their previous nights in the wilderness. The silence was somehow more unsettling than the original sounds had been, suggesting that something significant had disturbed the normal patterns of wildlife activity in their immediate vicinity. After several minutes of careful observation and listening, Dave had concluded that whatever had been near their camp had moved on. But the experience had left all three men somewhat shaken and much more alert to the potential for wildlife encounters than they had been during their first 2 days. The discussion that had followed as dawn broke over their campsite had focused on the implications of the nighttime visitor and whether their camping strategy needed to be modified in response to what appeared to be increasing wildlife activity in their immediate area. Bobby had suggested that the animal had most likely been a moose rather than a bear, based on the steady, deliberate nature of the footsteps, and the fact that bears typically move more quietly through forest environments. Mark had disagreed, pointing out that their experience the previous day had already confirmed the presence of bears in the immediate vicinity, and arguing that they should assume the worst-case scenario when evaluating potential threats to their safety. Dave had taken a middle position, acknowledging that they could not definitively identify the animal responsible for the disturbance while emphasizing the importance of maintaining their established safety protocols regardless of the specific threat they might be facing. His analysis had focused on the practical implications of their experience, noting that their bear spray and noisemakers had been readily available and that their response had been appropriate and well coordinated despite being awakened suddenly in complete darkness. The consensus had been that their safety procedures were working effectively, but that the increasing wildlife activity around their campsite required additional vigilance and possibly some modifications to their daily routines. The morning's fishing had proceeded with much greater attention to noise-making and situational awareness than had characterized their previous efforts, with all three men making deliberate efforts to announce their presence and avoid the kind of stealthy movement that could lead to surprise encounters with wildlife. The fishing remained excellent despite their increased caution, with salmon continuing to move through the system in numbers that exceeded their most optimistic expectations. However, the relaxed, peaceful atmosphere that had characterized their first 2 days had been replaced by a subtle tension that reflected their growing awareness of the wild and potentially dangerous nature of their environment. The first clearly threatening wildlife encounter of their trip had occurred during the late morning hours when Bobby had been fishing alone in a series of pools approximately half a mile upstream from their camp, an area that required hiking through dense willow thickets that limited visibility to a few yards in any direction. He had been working a particularly productive run when he had heard the unmistakable sound of a large animal moving through the brush on the opposite side of the pool. accompanied by what he later described as a low rumbling sound that he had never heard before, but which he instinctively recognized as potentially threatening. Bobby's response to this encounter had been textbook perfect, following the protocols they had practiced and discussed extensively during their preparation for the trip. He had immediately stopped fishing and backed away from the water while making noise by clapping his hands and talking in a loud, firm voice designed to alert the animal to his presence without appearing threatening or aggressive. He had also reached for his bear spray, removing the safety clip and preparing to deploy it if the situation escalated beyond a simple encounter between species that were both trying to use the same resource. The animal on the far side of the pool had responded to Bobby's noise-making by moving away through the brush, though not with the immediate flight that would have characterized a normal avoidance response. Instead, the sounds had suggested a large animal moving deliberately but not urgently through the vegetation, pausing occasionally as if assessing the situation rather than simply fleeing from human presence. This pattern of behavior had been somewhat concerning to Bobby, who had expected a more immediate retreat and who had interpreted the animal's deliberate movement as a possible sign of habituation to humans or reduced fear that could indicate a potentially dangerous individual. Bobby had remained in position for several minutes after the sounds had faded, waiting to ensure that the animal had truly departed before resuming his fishing activities. His caution had proved justified when he had discovered fresh bear tracks in the mud at the head of the pool, tracks that appeared to have been made within the previous hour, and which confirmed that his encounter had indeed been with a brown bear rather than a moose or other large mammal. The size of the tracks had been impressive even by Alaska standards, suggesting an individual that might weigh 600 pounds or more, and which would be capable of inflicting devastating damage if provoked or threatened. When Bobby had returned to camp for their midday break and reported his encounter to Dave and Mark, the group's discussion had taken on a more serious tone than their previous conversations about bear safety. The animal's behavior had differed significantly from the avoidance patterns they had expected based on their research and training, suggesting either an individual with reduced fear of humans or circumstances that were motivating the bear to remain in the area despite human presence. Either possibility had concerning implications for their safety and raised questions about whether their current camping strategy was appropriate for the conditions they were actually facing. Mark had been the most vocal advocate for modifying their approach in response to the morning's encounter, suggesting that they should consider fishing only as a group rather than splitting up to cover more water, and proposing that they should avoid areas with limited visibility where surprise encounters would be more likely. His analysis had focused on the risk assessment aspects of their situation, noting that their remote location and the multi-hour response time for any emergency assistance meant that even relatively minor injuries could have serious consequences if they occurred during a bear encounter. Dave had been more reluctant to modify their established routines, arguing that a single encounter with appropriate avoidance behavior did not necessarily indicate an ongoing threat, and that their safety protocols appeared to be working effectively to prevent direct confrontations. His perspective had been influenced by his engineering background and his preference for making decisions based on data rather than emotional responses to uncertain situations. However, he had agreed that the morning's events justified increased vigilance and some modifications to their fishing strategy to reduce the probability of additional encounters. Bobby had found himself caught between his friends' different approaches to risk assessment, recognizing the validity of Mark's concerns while sharing Dave's reluctance to abandon the fishing strategy that had been so successful during their first 2 days. His first-hand experience with the encounter had given him a different perspective than either of his friends could have, and he had emphasized that the bear's behavior, while not ideal, had not been overtly aggressive or threatening. The animal had responded appropriately to his presence and had moved away when confronted with human activity, suggesting normal behavioral patterns despite the proximity to their camp and fishing areas. The consensus that had emerged from their discussion was a compromise that incorporated elements of each man's perspective while maintaining their ability to fish effectively during the remainder of their stay. They had agreed to continue fishing in separate areas but to reduce the distances between their positions and to maintain more frequent communication through established check-in procedures. They had also agreed to avoid areas with particularly dense vegetation where visibility was severely limited, and to carry additional noisemakers that would help ensure that bears were aware of their presence before surprise encounters could develop. The afternoon fishing that day had proceeded under their modified safety protocols, with generally positive results that confirmed their ability to maintain both safety and fishing effectiveness through appropriate adjustments to their techniques and strategies. The salmon runs appeared to be maintaining their strength, with fresh fish continuing to enter the system and providing consistent action for all three anglers despite their increased caution and reduced flexibility in choosing fishing locations. The weather had remained favorable throughout the day, though afternoon cloud buildup had again suggested the possibility of evening thunderstorms that could complicate their activities. Their third evening in camp had been marked by another spectacular fishing session during the twilight hours, but the relaxed atmosphere of their previous evenings had been replaced by a subtle tension that reflected their growing awareness of the wildlife activity in their immediate vicinity. All three men had remained much more alert to their surroundings than during previous evenings, frequently pausing in their fishing to scan the forest edges and listen for sounds that might indicate approaching animals. The increased vigilance had not significantly impacted their fishing success, but it had changed the character of their experience from one of peaceful immersion in nature to something more resembling a carefully managed adventure in genuine wilderness conditions. As they had prepared their evening meal of fresh salmon and dehydrated vegetables, the conversation had inevitably turned to their wildlife encounters and their assessment of the overall safety situation as they approached the midpoint of their planned stay. Mark had expressed growing concern about the pattern of encounters they had experienced, noting that bear activity seemed to be increasing rather than decreasing as their presence in the area became established. His analysis had suggested that normal bear behavior would involve learning to avoid areas of consistent human activity, and the fact that this was not occurring might indicate unusual circumstances that they did not fully understand. Dave had offered a different interpretation of their experiences, suggesting that the salmon run itself was creating conditions that brought bears into the area regardless of human presence, and that their encounters represented normal competition for resources rather than problematic behavior patterns. His perspective had been that bears and humans had coexisted around salmon streams for thousands of years, and that their current situation, while requiring vigilance, was not necessarily dangerous, as long as they maintained appropriate safety protocols and avoided obvious mistakes in judgment or technique. Bobby had again found himself mediating between his friends' different risk assessments, though his own comfort level had been somewhat reduced by his morning encounter and the realization that bears in the area were not exhibiting the clear avoidance behavior that he had expected based on his previous, more limited experience with wildlife encounters. His commercial fishing background had given him exposure to bears along salmon streams, but always from the safety of boats, and never in situations where he was alone and potentially vulnerable to a determined animal. The evening had ended with all three men agreeing that they would continue their planned activities while maintaining heightened awareness and strict adherence to their established safety protocols. They had also agreed that any additional encounters that suggested increasingly bold behavior by bears in the area would trigger a serious discussion about the possibility of cutting their trip short and requesting early pickup by their charter service. While none of them wanted to abandon their excellent fishing and spectacular wilderness experience, they had all recognized that conditions could deteriorate beyond their ability to manage safely, and that retreat was a legitimate option if circumstances warranted it. Their sleep that third night had been more restless than during their previous nights in the wilderness, with all three men awakening periodically to listen for sounds that might indicate wildlife activity around their campsite. The forest had remained quiet throughout the night, with none of the disturbances that had characterized their previous evening, but their increased alertness had made it difficult to achieve the deep, restorative sleep that had left them refreshed and energetic during their first 2 days. The psychological impact of their wildlife encounters was beginning to affect their overall experience, adding an element of stress that competed with the relaxation and escape they had been seeking through their wilderness adventure. The fourth day of their trip had dawned clear and calm, with ideal weather conditions that promised another day of excellent fishing and spectacular scenery. However, the mood in camp had been subdued compared to their previous mornings, reflecting the accumulated impact of their wildlife encounters and their growing awareness of the potentially dangerous nature of their situation. The discussion over breakfast had focused primarily on their plans for the day and their strategy for managing the balance between fishing success and safety considerations that was becoming increasingly complex as their stay continued. Their fishing strategy for the fourth day had involved staying closer together than during their previous efforts, with no one venturing more than a few hundred yards from the others, and with regular communication that ensured everyone's location and status was known at all times. This approach had reduced their ability to cover as much water as during their earlier, more dispersed efforts, but it had provided increased security and peace of mind that allowed them to focus on their fishing rather than constantly scanning the forest for potential threats. The morning fishing had been excellent despite their modified approach, with salmon continuing to provide consistent action and the opportunity to catch fish that would rank among the largest and most beautiful of their Alaska fishing experiences. The river system's productivity seemed almost unlimited, with fresh fish entering constantly and providing opportunities that justified all the planning, expense, and effort required to reach such a remote location. However, the underlying tension created by their wildlife situation had prevented them from fully enjoying their success in the way they had during their first 2 days. The most significant wildlife encounter of their trip had occurred during the early afternoon when all three men were fishing a series of connected pools approximately 1/4 mile downstream from their camp, an area that provided excellent visibility and multiple escape routes that they had identified as among the safer locations in their immediate vicinity. They had been fishing successfully for nearly 2 hours, with all three men catching and releasing numerous salmon while retaining several beautiful fish for their evening meal, when Dave had noticed movement in the forest edge approximately 100 yards upstream from their position. The movement had initially appeared to be a large moose or possibly a caribou moving through the trees at the forest edge, but as the animal had emerged into better visibility, it had become clear that they were observing a massive brown bear that appeared to be following the river corridor in their general direction. The bear had been moving deliberately but not urgently, pausing periodically to investigate scent trails or potential food sources along the riverbank, in behavior that suggested a normal pattern of movement rather than any specific interest in the human activity downstream. All three men had immediately stopped fishing and moved closer together while preparing their bear spray and noisemakers for potential deployment, following the protocols they had practiced extensively during their preparation for the trip. They had also begun making noise by talking in normal tones and occasionally clapping their hands, designed to alert the bear to their presence while avoiding any sounds that might be interpreted as threatening or aggressive by an animal that was already aware of their location. The bear's response to their presence had initially followed the normal pattern they had expected, with the animal pausing in its movement and appearing to assess the situation from a distance that provided adequate safety margins for both species. However, rather than moving away from the human activity as their research and training had suggested was normal behavior, the bear had continued its approach along the riverbank, moving slowly and deliberately but not altering its course in response to their obvious presence and noise-making efforts. As the bear had approached to within approximately 50 yards of their position, all three men had begun to feel genuinely concerned about their ability to avoid a direct confrontation, and they had started to discuss the possibility of retreating from the area while the animal was still at a manageable distance. However, their movement away from the water had apparently triggered some change in the bear's behavior, as it had suddenly accelerated its approach and closed the distance to within 30 yards before stopping and rising up on its hind legs in what appeared to be an effort to better assess the situation. The sight of the bear at close range had been both magnificent and terrifying, with the animal standing nearly 8 feet tall on its hind legs and displaying the massive size and obvious power that makes brown bears one of the most formidable predators in North America. Its coat had been a rich chocolate brown color with lighter colored tips that created a grizzled appearance, and its small dark eyes had seemed to be evaluating the three men with an intelligence and focus that was deeply unsettling to experience at such close range. After what had seemed like hours but was probably less than 30 seconds, the bear had dropped back to all fours and resumed its movement along the riverbank, passing within 20 yards of their position without showing any obvious aggressive behavior, but also without displaying the kind of clear avoidance that would have indicated normal wariness of human presence. The animal had been massive even by Alaska standards, with Dave estimating its weight at 700 pounds or more based on its overall size and the thickness of its body as it moved through the forest understory. The three friends had remained motionless until the bear had disappeared into the forest downstream from their position, then had waited an additional 15 minutes before beginning to discuss their response to what had been by far their closest and most potentially dangerous wildlife encounter of the trip. The bear's behavior had been concerning on multiple levels, from its apparent lack of fear regarding human presence to its decision to approach and investigate, rather than simply avoiding the area until the humans had departed. Mark had been the most shaken by the encounter, arguing that the bear's behavior indicated either habituation to humans that could make it dangerous, or territorial behavior related to the salmon run that might lead to increasingly aggressive responses if they continued fishing in the area. His analysis had focused on the fact that normal bear behavior would have involved clear avoidance of their group once the animal became aware of their presence, and the bear's decision to approach and investigate suggested behavioral patterns that could escalate to genuine aggression if circumstances changed or if the animal decided that the humans represented a threat to its access to salmon resources. Bobby had been less pessimistic about the implications of the encounter, noting that the bear had not displayed any overtly aggressive behavior and had ultimately moved on without creating a direct confrontation. His interpretation had been that the animal was simply moving through its normal territory and had investigated the unusual presence of humans without deciding that they represented a significant threat or impediment to its activities. However, he had acknowledged that the bear's size and apparent confidence around humans was concerning, and suggested that additional encounters might be more problematic. Dave had attempted to provide a balanced assessment of their situation, acknowledging the legitimate concerns raised by the encounter, while noting that the bear's behavior, though not ideal, had remained within the bounds of what might be considered normal for a wild animal investigating an unusual situation. His engineering background had led him to focus on the specific behaviors they had observed rather than speculating about the bear's intentions or future behavior patterns, and his analysis had suggested that their safety protocols had worked effectively to prevent the encounter from escalating to a dangerous level. The discussion that had followed their encounter had been the most serious conversation about safety that the group had engaged in during their trip, with all three men acknowledging that their situation had fundamentally changed and that their original assessment of the risks they were facing might have been overly optimistic. The combination of multiple encounters with apparently the same individual bear, the animal's lack of normal avoidance behavior, and the proximity of the encounter had created conditions that exceeded the parameters they had planned for when designing their safety protocols. Mark had advocated strongly for ending their trip immediately and contacting their charter service for emergency pickup, arguing that the pattern of encounters they had experienced indicated conditions that were likely to deteriorate further and potentially lead to a dangerous confrontation that they were not equipped to handle. His risk assessment had focused on the fact that their remote location and the delay inherent in emergency response meant that even a relatively minor bear attack could have catastrophic consequences, and that the prudent course of action was to evacuate the area before conditions worsened. Dave had been more reluctant to abandon their trip based on a single encounter, even one as concerning as they had just experienced, arguing that hasty decisions based on emotional responses rather than careful analysis often led to poor outcomes in wilderness situations. His preference had been to modify their activities and safety protocols to reduce the probability of additional encounters while maintaining their ability to complete their planned fishing trip. However, he had acknowledged that Mark's concerns were legitimate, and that emergency evacuation was a reasonable option if additional encounters occurred. Bobby had found himself genuinely torn between his desire to continue their excellent fishing experience and his growing concern about the bear situation, recognizing that their encounter had been much closer to a dangerous confrontation than any of them had anticipated when planning their trip. His commercial fishing experience had given him confidence in his ability to handle challenging situations, but he had also developed a healthy respect for situations that exceeded his control or expertise, and he was beginning to suspect that their current circumstances might fall into that category. The compromise that had emerged from their discussion involved implementing significantly more conservative safety protocols while continuing their trip for the remaining day before their scheduled pickup. They had agreed to fish only as a group rather than splitting up to avoid areas with limited visibility or difficult escape routes, and to establish a schedule that would minimize their time on the water during dawn and dusk hours when bear activity was typically highest. They had also agreed that any additional encounters with bears would trigger immediate contact with their charter service for emergency pickup regardless of weather, conditions, or other complications. Their afternoon fishing under the new protocols had been successful but subdued, with excellent salmon action continuing to provide entertainment and the opportunity to catch fish for their final evening meal, but with the relaxed enjoyment of their previous days replaced by constant vigilance and awareness of their surroundings. The modified approach had reduced their efficiency and coverage while increasing their sense of security, but all three men had found it difficult to completely relax and immerse themselves in the fishing experience that had brought them to this remote location. As evening had approached on their fourth day, the three friends had returned to their campsite earlier than during their previous days, wanting to ensure adequate time for meal preparation and camp organization before the reduced visibility of twilight hours increased their vulnerability to surprise wildlife encounters. Their camp had shown no signs of disturbance during their absence, and their food storage systems had remained intact and properly secured. But the proximity of their afternoon bear encounter had made them much more aware of how exposed and vulnerable their position was in the event that wildlife decided to investigate their presence more closely. Their final evening around the campfire had been marked by a mixture of satisfaction about their fishing success and concern about the wildlife situation that had increasingly dominated their experience during the latter part of their stay. The conversation had ranged across many topics, from their analysis of the fishing techniques that had been most successful to their speculation about the bear behavior they had observed and their assessment of the lessons they would take away from their wilderness adventure. However, the underlying tension created by their wildlife encounters had prevented the evening from achieving the relaxed, celebratory atmosphere they had experienced during their earlier days. As they had prepared for their final night in the wilderness, all three men had expressed mixed feelings about their approaching departure, recognizing that they had experienced some of the finest fishing of their lives while also acknowledging that the bear situation had created stress and anxiety that detracted from their overall enjoyment of the experience. The consensus had been that their trip planning and safety protocols had been generally effective, but that the specific conditions they had encountered required modifications to their approach that they would implement in future wilderness adventures. Their sleep that final night had been restless and interrupted, with all three men awakening frequently to listen for sounds that might indicate wildlife activity around their campsite. The forest had remained relatively quiet throughout the night, with only normal sounds of small animals and night birds that posed no threat to their safety. But their accumulated stress and anxiety had made it difficult to achieve truly restful sleep even in the absence of any obvious threats. The morning of their scheduled departure had begun with a routine that had become familiar over their previous days, but with an additional urgency created by their eagerness to break camp and prepare for their pickup flight while avoiding any additional wildlife encounters that might complicate their departure. The weather had remained favorable for flying, with clear skies and light winds that would allow their charter pilot to land and depart without weather-related delays, and their radio contact with Midnight Sun Aviation had confirmed that Captain Morrison was on schedule for their mid-morning pickup. Their final breakfast in the wilderness had been a subdued affair, with excellent freeze-dried meals and strong coffee providing the energy they would need for breaking camp and preparing their gear for transport, but with conversation focusing primarily on logistical details rather than the kind of storytelling and reminiscing that had characterized their previous mornings. The accumulated stress of their wildlife encounters had taken a psychological toll that was becoming increasingly apparent as their trip neared its conclusion, and all three men were looking forward to the safety and security of civilization even as they appreciated the extraordinary fishing and spectacular scenery they had experienced. The process of breaking camp and preparing for departure had proceeded efficiently and systematically, with each man taking responsibility for familiar tasks that would ensure their gear was properly packed and ready for transport while minimizing the time required to complete their departure once their aircraft arrived. Dave had focused on organizing and packing their fishing gear and electronics, ensuring that expensive equipment was protected for the rough handling that characterized bush flying operations. Mark had been responsible for packing their personal gear and clothing, while Bobby had handled the food and cooking equipment that required special care to prevent contamination or damage during transport. As they had worked to dismantle their camp and prepare for departure, the three friends had found themselves constantly scanning the surrounding forest for signs of wildlife activity, unable to completely relax even during the routine tasks that should have provided distraction from their concerns about bear encounters. The accumulated stress of their stay had heightened their alertness to a degree that made every sound and movement potentially significant, and they had found themselves starting at bird calls and wind sounds that they had barely noticed during their earlier, more relaxed days. Their gear preparation had been completed nearly an hour before their scheduled pickup time, leaving them with time to fish one final pool near their landing area while remaining close enough to their departure point to respond immediately when their aircraft appeared. The fishing during their final hour had been excellent, with fresh salmon continuing to move through the system and providing action that reminded them of why they had been willing to accept the risks and challenges of wilderness travel to experience this kind of pristine fishing environment. However, their final fishing session had been interrupted by what would prove to be their most serious and terrifying wildlife encounter, when Mark, who had been fishing alone in a shallow run approximately 50 yards from where Dave and Bobby were working a deeper pool, had suddenly found himself face to face with the massive brown bear they had encountered the previous afternoon, but this time at a distance of less than 10 yards with no clear escape route and no time to deploy his bear spray before the animal could reach him if it decided to attack. The bear had approached Mark's position with complete silence, moving through the willow thickets with a stealth that seemed impossible for an animal of its size, and had emerged into the open area where Mark was fishing before he became aware of its presence. Mark's first indication that he was no longer alone had been the sound of the bear's breathing and the sight of its massive form, standing at the edge of the brush, watching him with an intensity and focus that immediately communicated the gravity of his situation. Mark's response to finding himself in this terrifying position had been to freeze completely, following the protocols they had discussed for close encounters where sudden movements might trigger an attack. He had remained motionless while the bear studied him, maintaining eye contact without staring directly at the animal in a way that might be interpreted as threatening, while slowly reaching for his bear spray with movements so gradual that they were barely perceptible. The bear had remained stationary for what seemed like an eternity, apparently assessing Mark and the situation while deciding how to respond to this unexpected encounter. Dave and Bobby, fishing 50 yards away, had been unaware of Mark's predicament until they had heard him calling their names in a voice that immediately communicated extreme distress and urgent need for assistance. When they had looked in his direction and seen the bear standing so close to their friend, both men had immediately begun moving toward Mark's position while preparing their own bear spray and noisemakers, but they had been forced to approach slowly and carefully to avoid triggering an aggressive response from the bear that was already in an extremely dangerous position relative to Mark. The standoff had continued for several more minutes, with the bear apparently unable to decide whether Mark represented a threat or simply an obstacle to its intended route along the riverbank. During this time, Mark had managed to remove the safety clip from his bear spray and position it for immediate deployment, though the proximity of the bear meant that using it would likely result in exposure to the spray himself and might trigger exactly the kind of aggressive response he was trying to avoid. The resolution of the encounter had come when Dave and Bobby, approaching from different angles to avoid presenting a concentrated target, had begun making loud noises and movements designed to distract the bear and provide Mark with an opportunity to withdraw from his exposed position. The bear had responded to the additional human activity by turning its attention away from Mark toward the new sources of disturbance, and in that moment Mark had been able to back away slowly while the bear focused on assessing the threats posed by his friends. However, rather than retreating in response to the presence of 3 humans making noise and displaying defensive behavior, the bear had appeared to become agitated and had begun moving toward Dave and Bobby with what appeared to be aggressive intent. This escalation had forced all 3 men to deploy their bear spray simultaneously, creating a cloud of capsicum aerosol that had enveloped the immediate area and forced both the humans and the bear to retreat from the contaminated zone while dealing with the effects of exposure to the powerful irritant. The bear's response to the bear spray had been immediate and violent, with the animal roaring in pain and anger while thrashing through the surrounding vegetation in apparent distress from the chemical exposure. However, rather than fleeing the area as the 3 friends had expected, the bear had paused at a distance of approximately 30 yards and had begun what could only be described as aggressive behavior, including jaw-popping, ear-flattening, and the production of low, rumbling vocalizations that clearly communicated its displeasure with the situation and its potential willingness to escalate the encounter to physical confrontation. At this point, all 3 men had realized that their situation had deteriorated beyond their ability to manage safely. and they had begun a fighting retreat toward their aircraft landing area while maintaining their formation and preparing for the possibility that the bear might charge their group. The bear had followed their movement at a distance of 20 to 30 yards, displaying continued aggressive behavior but not yet committing to a full charge that would have forced them to defend themselves with whatever means available. The sound of their approaching aircraft had reached them during this terrifying retreat, with Captain Morrison's Bell 206 appearing over the tree line at exactly the scheduled pickup time and providing both a potential means of escape and a complication in the form of additional noise and movement that might further agitate the already aggressive bear. Morrison had immediately recognized the seriousness of their situation and had begun her approach to the gravel bar landing area while the three men continued their retreat. But the helicopter's presence had seemed to increase rather than decrease the bear's agitation level. As the helicopter had settled onto the gravel bar and Morrison had begun preparing for immediate departure, the bear had made its decision to escalate the encounter to a physical attack, charging across the remaining distance, separating it from the three men with a speed and determination that left no doubt about its aggressive intentions. The charge had covered the final 30 yards in seconds, with the bear moving in a straight line toward Bobby, who had been slightly separated from his friends during their retreat and who had become the focus of the animal's aggressive response. Bobby's attempt to evade the charging bear had been unsuccessful despite his commercial fishing background and his experience with dangerous situations, as the bear's speed and agility had allowed it to close the distance faster than Bobby could retreat toward the safety of the helicopter. The impact when the bear reached Bobby had been devastating, with the animal's momentum and massive size combining to knock Bobby to the ground with tremendous force, while its claws and teeth began inflicting the kind of damage that would shortly transform their fishing adventure into a desperate struggle for survival. Dave's response to seeing his friend attacked had been immediate and instinctive, involving a charge toward the bear with his remaining bear spray and whatever rocks and sticks he could grab, but his intervention had only succeeded in drawing the bear's attention to himself and had resulted in the animal turning its attack to include him as a target. The bear's transition from attacking Bobby to including Dave in its aggressive response had happened with shocking speed, and within seconds both men were on the ground dealing with an enraged predator whose size and strength made effective resistance nearly impossible. Mark's position during the initial attack had given him a clear view of the horror being visited upon his friends, but his attempts to help had been complicated by his need to avoid becoming the bear's third victim, and his realization that their situation had deteriorated to the point where survival rather than rescue had become the primary consideration. His decision to continue toward the helicopter while his friends were being mauled represented the kind of impossible choice that emergency situations sometimes require, but his actions would ultimately prove crucial to their survival. Captain Morrison's response to the unfolding attack had been to maintain her position at the landing zone while preparing for immediate departure once any survivors could reach her aircraft. But the proximity of the bear attack to her landing area meant that her own safety was at risk if the bear decided to expand its aggressive behavior to include the aircraft and its crew. Her radio calls for emergency assistance had begun immediately, with requests for medical evacuation and law enforcement response that would bring help racing across hundreds of miles of Alaska wilderness. The bear's attack on Dave and Bobby had continued for what seemed like hours but was probably less than 5 minutes, with both men sustaining massive injuries that would require immediate medical attention if they were to survive the encounter. The animal's behavior during the attack had been characterized by the kind of sustained aggression that suggested either protective behavior related to cubs or territory, or predatory behavior that represented an attempt to kill and consume its victims rather than simply drive them away from a perceived threat. Bobby's injuries had been the most severe, with massive lacerations to his arms, legs, and torso that had severed major blood vessels and created immediately life-threatening hemorrhage that required desperate measures to control even temporarily. His attempts to protect himself by playing dead had been unsuccessful in stopping the attack, and the bear had continued to maul him even after he had stopped moving and resisting. The damage to his extremities had been particularly devastating, with several fingers severed completely and his left arm mangled to the point where amputation would later prove necessary. Dave's injuries, while also severe, had been somewhat less extensive due to his position during the attack and his success in protecting his vital areas with his arms and legs. However, he had sustained deep lacerations to his forearms and hands that had damaged tendons and muscle groups essential for normal function, and his attempts to fight back had resulted in additional injuries to his face and scalp that would require extensive reconstructive surgery. His injuries had also included several broken ribs and possible internal damage that would not become apparent until medical evaluation could be completed. Mark's escape to the helicopter had been successful, but his ability to provide assistance to his friends had been limited by the continuing presence of the bear and the need to coordinate with Captain Morrison for emergency evacuation procedures that could extract the injured men without further endangering anyone involved in the rescue effort. His radio communications with emergency services had provided crucial information about the nature and severity of the injuries that rescue teams would need to treat, allowing medical personnel to begin preparing for the massive trauma cases they would soon receive. The bear's eventual withdrawal from the attack site had occurred when the helicopter's rotor noise and the presence of additional humans had apparently convinced the animal that the situation represented more threat than it was willing to accept. But the animal had not fled the immediate area and had remained visible at the forest edge while Morrison and Mark had attempted to reach the injured men. This continuing threat had complicated rescue efforts and had forced them to work quickly and efficiently to evacuate Dave and Bobby before the bear decided to resume its aggressive behavior. The medical treatment that Dave and Bobby had received during the helicopter flight to Fairbanks Memorial Hospital had been basic trauma care designed to stabilize their conditions and prevent immediate death from blood loss. But the severity of their injuries had exceeded the capabilities of field treatment and had required the kind of advanced surgical intervention that was only available at a major trauma center. Morrison's flying during the evacuation had been aggressive and skilled, cutting normal flight times significantly while maintaining the stability needed for Mark to continue applying pressure to wounds and monitoring vital signs. The arrival at Fairbanks Memorial Hospital had triggered a massive emergency response that had been prepared based on Mark's radio communications during the flight, with trauma teams standing by and blood products available in quantities sufficient to deal with the severe hemorrhage that both men had sustained. The initial medical assessment had confirmed that both Dave and Bobby had suffered injuries that would be life-threatening without immediate surgical intervention, and the decision had been made to proceed directly to operating rooms without the detailed diagnostic procedures that would normally precede such extensive surgery. Bobby's surgical treatment had required a team of specialists working for more than 8 hours to control bleeding, repair damaged blood vessels, and address the massive soft tissue damage that the bear attack had inflicted. The decision to amputate his left arm below the elbow had been made early in the surgical process, when it became clear that the damage to bones, muscles, and blood vessels was beyond repair, and the focus had shifted to preserving as much function as possible in his remaining extremities while ensuring his survival. His recovery had been complicated by infection, blood loss, anemia, and the psychological trauma associated with his permanent disability. Dave's surgical treatment had been somewhat less extensive, but had still required multiple procedures to repair the damage to his arms and hands while addressing internal injuries that had included a punctured lung and possible liver damage. His facial injuries had required plastic surgery to address lacerations that had damaged both functional and cosmetic aspects of his appearance, and his recovery timeline had been measured in months rather than weeks. The permanent disabilities resulting from his injuries had included reduced function in both hands and ongoing problems with nerve damage that affected his ability to perform the detailed work that his engineering career required. Mark's physical injuries had been limited to minor exposure to bear spray and the emotional trauma associated with witnessing his friend's attack and being unable to provide effective assistance during the encounter. However, the psychological impact of the experience had been severe and long-lasting, with symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder that had required professional counseling and had affected his ability to return to normal outdoor activities. His survivor guilt and his ongoing concerns about his friend's recovery had created emotional challenges that had proved more difficult to address than physical injuries. The investigation into the bear attack had been conducted by both National Park Service personnel and Alaska Department of Fish and Game officials, with the primary goals being to determine the cause of the aggressive behavior and to locate and evaluate the individual bear responsible for the attack. Tracking efforts had been successful in locating the bear within 24 hours of the incident, and the decision had been made to destroy the animal based on its demonstrated aggressive behavior toward humans and the risk it posed to other visitors to the area. The necropsy performed on the bear had revealed that it was an adult male weighing approximately 650 pounds in good physical condition, but with evidence of old injuries that might have affected its behavior toward humans. The animal's stomach contents had included salmon remains but no human tissue, indicating that the attack had been motivated by territorial or defensive behavior rather than predatory intent. However, the sustained nature of the attack and the bear's apparent lack of normal fear responses had suggested behavioral abnormalities that made it unsuitable for relocation and justified the decision to destroy it. The aftermath of the attack had included extensive media coverage that had focused public attention on bear safety issues and had led to increased funding for bear research and public education programs throughout Alaska. The Three Friends experience had become a case study that was used in bear safety training programs and had contributed to improved protocols for wilderness travelers in areas with high bear populations. However, the personal cost of their experience had been enormous and had fundamentally changed their relationship with the outdoor activities that had previously provided some of the most rewarding experiences of their lives. Dave's recovery had progressed slowly but steadily, with multiple surgical procedures required to restore partial function to his hands and arms, while addressing the ongoing complications associated with nerve damage and scar tissue formation. His return to work had been possible, but had required accommodations for his reduced dexterity and strength, and his career advancement had been affected by his inability to perform some of the physical tasks that his position required. His psychological recovery had included coming to terms with the permanent changes to his capabilities, and his recognition that his wilderness adventures would need to be significantly modified to account for his disabilities. Bobby's adjustment to life as an amputee had been the most challenging aspect of his recovery, requiring extensive rehabilitation and adaptation of his living situation to accommodate his reduced capabilities. His commercial fishing career had been ended by his injuries, forcing him to develop new skills and find alternative employment that was compatible with his disability. However, his natural optimism and determination had enabled him to make remarkable progress in adapting to his new circumstances, and he had eventually become an advocate for wilderness safety education and disability awareness. Mark's recovery from the psychological trauma of the experience had been complicated by his continued feelings of responsibility for his friend's injuries and his questioning of the decisions that had led them to continue their trip despite the warning signs they had observed. His return to outdoor activities had been extremely limited, and he had found it difficult to enjoy wilderness experiences that reminded him of their terrifying encounter. His friendships with Dave and Bobby had remained strong, but the shared trauma had created emotional complications that required ongoing attention and professional counseling to address effectively. The analysis of the bear attack by wildlife behavior experts had concluded that the encounter represented a combination of factors that had created conditions for aggressive behavior, including the drought-reduced berry crop that had concentrated bears around salmon streams, the late-season timing that corresponded with peak feeding activity before hibernation, and the specific territorial behaviors associated with an adult male bear protecting a prime fishing area. The sustained nature of the attack had been attributed to the bear's size and confidence, combined with its apparent lack of previous negative experiences with humans that might have taught it to avoid such encounters. The lessons learned from their experience had emphasized the importance of flexible trip planning that allows for changing conditions, the value of conservative decision-making when wildlife encounters suggest unusual patterns of behavior, and the recognition that even careful preparation and appropriate safety protocols cannot eliminate all risks associated with wilderness travel in areas with large predator populations. Their experience had also highlighted the importance of emergency communication capabilities and the value of professional rescue services that can respond rapidly to wilderness emergencies. The broader implications of their bear encounter had included increased awareness of the challenges associated with climate change impacts on wildlife behavior, with the drought conditions that had affected berry production representing the kind of environmental changes that were becoming more frequent and more severe throughout Alaska. The concentration of bears around salmon streams during drought years had created higher encounter rates with humans, leading to increased numbers of defensive and territorial attacks that pose growing challenges for wilderness recreation and tourism. The Three Friends story had become part of the growing body of knowledge about human-bear interactions in Alaska, contributing to improved safety protocols and educational programs that helped other wilderness travelers understand and manage the risks associated with outdoor activities in bear country. However, the personal cost of their contribution to this knowledge base had been enormous, and their experience served as a sobering reminder of the potential consequences when wilderness adventurers encounter the raw power and unpredictability of truly wild predators. Years after their terrifying encounter, the three men continued to maintain their friendship despite the fundamental changes that the bear attack had brought to their lives. Though their shared outdoor adventures had been replaced by different activities that posed fewer risks and created fewer reminders of their traumatic experience. Their story continued to be told in bear safety classes and wilderness education programs, serving as a powerful example of how quickly and dramatically outdoor adventures could turn dangerous when human activities intersected with the territorial and feeding behaviors of Alaska's most formidable predators. The Kantishna River continued to flow through its pristine wilderness setting, supporting healthy salmon runs and bear populations that remained largely unchanged by the human tragedy that had occurred along its banks, serving as a reminder that the natural world operates according to its own laws and priorities that sometimes conflict with human plans and expectations. The area where their camp had been established remained a prime fishing location that continued to attract both salmon and the bears that depended on them for survival, though improved safety protocols and increased awareness of bear behavior had helped reduce the likelihood that future visitors would experience similar encounters. In reflecting on their experience, all three men had come to appreciate both the extraordinary beauty and the genuine dangers that characterized Alaska's wilderness areas, recognizing that their love of the outdoors had led them into a situation that exceeded their ability to control despite their careful planning and extensive preparation. Their story had become a testament to the importance of respecting the power and unpredictability of wild animals, while also illustrating the bonds of friendship that can help people survive and recover from experiences that challenge the very foundations of their understanding about their place in the natural world. What lessons should outdoor enthusiasts take from this harrowing encounter about the balance between pursuing wilderness adventures and maintaining appropriate respect for the dangers that wild animals can pose? How might climate change and environmental pressures continue to affect wildlife behavior patterns in ways that create increased risks for human recreation in remote areas? What role should personal responsibility versus institutional regulations play in managing the risks associated with wilderness travel in regions with large predator populations? How can the outdoor recreation community honor the experiences of attack survivors while continuing to promote the wilderness activities that provide so much meaning and satisfaction to those who seek authentic connections with the natural world? What technological or procedural innovations might help future wilderness travelers better assess and respond to wildlife threats without fundamentally changing the character of the wilderness experience they are seeking? How should we weigh the statistical rarity of serious wildlife encounters against the potentially catastrophic consequences when such encounters do occur, and what does this calculation suggest about the decisions that individuals and families should make about wilderness recreation activities? If this story has resonated with you or provided insights into the challenges and rewards of wilderness travel in Alaska, please share your thoughts in the comments below and consider subscribing to our channel for more in-depth explorations of survival stories and outdoor adventures that test the limits of human preparation and resilience in some of the most beautiful and dangerous places on Earth. Next week, we'll be examining another extraordinary survival story involving a solo hiker's encounter with a pack of wolves in the Brooks Range, a tale that illustrates different aspects of wildlife behavior and human decision-making under extreme stress that will provide additional perspectives on what it means to venture into the true wilderness that still exists in the far corners of our continent